Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. Jim Browdy and Marjorie Egan. Here with us in Studio 3 to go over the latest education headlines is Paul Revlle. Paul's a professor at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education, where he also runs the Education Redesign Lab. His new book, co-authored with Elaine Weiss, is Broader, Bolder, Better: How Schools and Communities Help Students Overcome the Disadvantages of Poverty, even though we're going to learn today some have not. Hello, Paul Revlle.
Hello, Jim and Marjorie. Happy Halloween.
Thank you very
too,
much.
Of course.
Yeah, you haven't noticed my costume. I came as a policy wonk today. I have green eye shade and a big mouth.
Oh, very good. Very good, yeah. Okay, so reading scores on national exams have declined in half the states, United States of America. The New York Times
Pretty disappointing.
is reporting. We keep hearing these things, and you keep saying, is there something fundamentally wrong, or are we lagging behind other countries, or what's going on?
I mean,
Massachusetts is not. We're going to have a notable exception.
Well,
yeah,
in the wealthy towns.
We're
in
first in the nation, but when you look at our scores, they're more or less flat or declining, and certain achievement gaps have widened, and we're tied with states like Florida and Arizona in the math scores. I mean, there's a lot to be desired here relative to what we set out to do in education reform, and whether you're looking nationally or you're looking statewide, we're just not getting the results we aspired to get. And I just think it's time that we step back and take a look at this as a form of a national crisis. And I don't think we have the paradigm right. As I've argued for a long time, I think it's a larger question than just what's happening in the schools. I think it's a crying shame that we have no presidential candidates of either party really talking about it. And so this is just further evidence in a decade in which we've spent a fortune on education reform, and we've worked hard at it. Teachers and students and schools have worked hard at various forms of changing and improving what happens inside of schools. Not all of it effective, but some of it clearly doing what it was intended to do, and still we're not getting the results we're looking for.
When you say we need a paradigm change, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, we're looking at the problem of improving student performance as solely a problem of increasing the functioning of schools as we know it. In other words, of increasing the quality of curriculum and instruction. And there's no question that there needs to be improvements in the quality of curriculum and instruction. But when we look at chronically underperforming systems, for example, the city of Providence now, which has generated a lot of controversy because of the recent report Johns Hopkins did on the total failure of so many aspects of that school system. One of the salient statistics that emerges from there is they've got a 52% chronic absence rate. That's 52% of kids missing more than 10% of the year. So students aren't showing up in the first place, and that has less to do with what's going on in the schools and more to do with what's going on in their lives. Look at the Globe feature that they did on the kid who went to the Brighton High School versus the Newton South. That was less about the schools. That teacher in the school in Brighton was a terrific teacher by all accounts, but he was dealing with kids who were suffering such circumstances in the conditions of their lives outside that it made it difficult to make progress with them. So unless we take those circumstances into account and try to mitigate those in some way, I'm afraid we're going to continue to see these sorts of results, because what it really tells us is schools on the whole are too weak in intervention to change the overall learning equation for students. I mean, it does for some people, but 80% of students' time is spent outside of school, and that makes a big difference.
By the way, I think we're at the stage where the sane people talking about healthcare and education, where everybody raises their hand when you're done what you just said and says, do you all agree? Yes, we agree. But this notion that, again, we discuss it with healthcare all the time. It's all these environments. You have to have decent housing. You have to have decent nutrition.
It's the same thing in healthcare.
And the same thing.
Yeah.
But the reality is we're not even funding the core stuff at a level that is adequate. And the notion that all of a sudden our politicians are going to have an epiphany and say we have to have a revolution. Of course, that's, I guess, what some politicians running for president are saying, to fix these things. There's got to be some interim steps so that, as Marjorie has often said to me when we fight about education stuff, or we're going to lose another generation of kids. Are there no models of poor kids, kids of color who are not losing ground like they are in Boston,
sure.
but gaining ground. So why
Yeah.
can't they
And
be
so a
emulated?
lot of them are in charter schools.
Why can't they be? It's not just charter schools. Why can't they be emulated?
Well, there's certain exceptional schools, but on any distribution of achievement, you're going to have exceptional performance. I mean, Tiger Woods plays golf at a certain level, but we all can't play at that level. So if we're going to get the rest of the field to play like Tiger Woods, then it's going to take extraordinary interventions.
But are
to get
Latino
them
and
there.
black kids falling behind in every major urban area in these tests like they are in Boston? That can't
Well,
be. Is
actually,
that
the
true?
national test results showed some improvement in urban areas. That was one bright spot.
For kids
But
of color?
Yeah, for kids of color.
So why are we the outlier?
Well, I don't
They're
know.
not fixing all the environmental
No, I mean,
things.
in Boston, we're going, going in the opposite direction, and that's disappointing. And it just, it shows you what an enormous challenge Boston School Committee and the new superintendent is facing as they go forward here. The results are very disappointing over the past few years.
And I know you know this better as an education secretary and a guy who spent your life in and around education. I don't want to sound like Marjorie, but I share her view. If you're a parent and you wake up to read the test score story, and you're a Boston parent and you read the test score, I mean,
totally disheartening.
what do you? And I don't have enough money to send my kids to.
Yeah, you feel trapped.
I mean, it's just you
trapped.
feel, and not only you trapped, but your kid is trapped through no folder of his or her own.
I mean, Jim, to get back to your earlier question, I mean, obviously we don't change these things overnight. So nobody's gonna bring about a revolution in a very conservative field like education. I mean, our schools look a lot like they used to look in the early 20th century.
Nothing
so
has changed.
It hasn't changed fundamentally.
But we always had poverty
However what?
in America. We always had terrible poverty in
Yeah,
America.
well, doing things to alleviate that. Cory Booker recently, for example, proposed a program to eliminate childhood poverty. Now, it wasn't an education program per se, but it's trying to create a platform, something like a level playing field on which all kids arrive at school. And we found out how to do that. I mean, those of us who have privilege do it for our own children. Scandinavian countries who create, a certain kinds of stability with respect to housing and nutrition and safety and things of that nature. Those are prerequisites to children learning.
How did Cory Booker do when he was mayor of Newark on education? Because I know most of what he did was a disaster, with all due respect to Booker's supporters.
No, honestly, he didn't. His track record there wasn't very effective. They tried to bring in some silver bullet reforms. They got a lot of money from a big philanthropist. The money was spent in ways that I don't think were very productive. Whole books have been written about it, and they don't reflect that well on the mayor's leadership.
But I guess what I wonder, we have always had terrible poverty in the United States. People coming from other countries, immigrant families starting here anew. The poverty during the Depression, the poverty in certain farming districts and stuff like that. So I guess what I wonder is were we just not testing then and didn't know?
No, it's a great question, but what's happened is the bar has gone up. In other words, we had poverty. We had people dropping out of school at much higher rates than they drop out of school now.
But it didn't matter then.
We had fewer people.
Because of
but
industrial
you could still
jobs.
get a job.
Yeah, okay.
And you could make a middle-class living on a ninth grade education right here in Massachusetts. We had a GM plant in Framingham. You could drop out with a ninth grade education,
and
go to work there, and live the American dream, the middle-class life, buy a house, have a car, send your kids to college. Can't do it anymore.
So the Scandinavian countries are obviously not like ours. We're very different from them, much more
Of course.
heterogeneous and stuff like that. But I'm wondering if there's another country around the world that is at all similar to us, that is doing things in a way that might be instructive.
Well, they're doing pieces of the puzzle. So it's pieces of the puzzle. So, example, you go to a lot of the European OECD countries, and you see they've made an enormous commitment to early childhood education. Many of those countries, early childhood education, which we know from the research has an enormous return on investment, is one of the most effective expenditures you can make in education, is to invest early when the brain is developing. And those countries make it an entitlement, not kind of a lottery the way it is in this country.
One last thing here: if Massachusetts remains number one, despite what Marjorie said a minute ago, it can't be all suburbs. Obviously, some cities need to be performing well. Which are they, and what are they doing that could be replicated?
Well, what's happening in Massachusetts is it's averages. So it's all being rolled up into averages. I mean, all of our cities are struggling, and I'm happy on another front that this school finance bill is moving through the legislature and looks like it's going to get there, because most of our cities have significantly reduced their funding, their expenditure on teachers and teaching. I can't think.
But as we
of
learned
Boston
in that Newton versus Boston thing, there was higher per pupil expenditure. Admittedly, really the needs are greater for the Boston kid than for the Newton kid. Is that
That's
not
right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, no, that was one of the ironies. And teachers paid more in Boston than in other places. You got a lot of senior teachers. You got a higher pay scale in Boston. Still, the number of teachers and the student-teacher ratios and things like that have to be looked at more closely.
So you said a couple of minutes ago, which sort of surprised me, that we haven't heard much out of the candidates on education. Maybe we haven't heard it on the debate stage, but when I read about Warren's education plan, I think I read in the New York Times, she was the last of the major candidates to come out with something. So
well, they put policies up, but they don't want to talk about it.
Oh,
because
okay.
It's a treacherous thing. So we had the Democratic debate the other night. 3 hours, education was not mentioned.
Okay, so let's talk about her for a second. My understanding, this will make Marjorie happy, no federal money for new charters. No federal money at all.
I think her plan is horrible.
No public money, federal money for for-profit charters. I assume you agree with that.
Yes, I do.
Is she eliminating high-stakes testing or just scaling it back? Is that her proposal? Do you know?
She is trying to eliminate the stakes. She's not saying she's
I see.
opposed to
Okay,
standardized
okay.
testing. I read one commentary this morning that described this as a long genuflection to the unions.
Well, this is where the Democrats are so wrong all the time.
Sorry?
Sorry. The Democrats are wholly owned subsidiaries of the teachers' unions nationwide.
Well, the
they don't
Democrats
care
at
about
least
the
have
kids,
this
I know.
tension between progressive elements and the union elements, which is why you get candidates like Hillary Clinton or the whole flock of them up on stage don't really want to bring it up, because no matter how you bring up, it's not just this issue. It's not just charters. It's testing. It's teacher evaluation. It's Common Core standards. If you bring those topics up within the Democratic Party, you're going to alienate some significant group of the constituency.
Yeah, but let's wait a second.
Depending on where you land.
Barack Obama was a relatively prominent Democrat. He supported charter schools.
Yes, he
Deval
did.
Patrick was a relatively prominent Democrat locally. He supported charter schools. It's not like they're not.
It's
prominent.
not impossible to do, but
They become villains.
The climate has gotten more vitriolic and divisive, and so ever since 2016, I mean, in that campaign, neither Trump nor Clinton spent any significant time talking about K-12 education, and the same thing is happening now. It's just not on the agenda.
So, but last thought about that. I mean, well, two thoughts about this. I'm sure you think a lot about why they don't talk about the issues. I assume it isn't because they don't think people care, because almost everybody has or will have or has had a kid in a public school.
Yeah, and the polls show that. The public cares about it.
So I assume the reason they don't talk about it is they know, or they've convinced themselves they can't fix it. Is that not?
Well, it's partly that. It's partly discouragement with the most recent efforts to fix it. In other words, we've had a 30-year run at education reform. We did things that I think were necessary and important to do, but they're clearly not sufficient to move the needle. People are discouraged. There's a lack of a common vision about where we go from here. You know, there are a lot of silver bullets. Some people say charter schools. Other people say just do this form of instruction or that form of instruction. Somebody else says it's all about early childhood, as I just said earlier. That's important. But nobody has a sort of comprehensive vision in the way in the early 90s the states rallied around standards, assessments, accountability, some measure of choice, use of data, focus on teaching, turning around underperforming schools. There was an agenda, and all your governors wanted to be education governors, and all your business leaders wanted to be education CEOs. Now those people have fled to the wings because the space is just too dangerous, the results are too disappointing, and there's no vision. So we need vision, or we're not going to be able to move forward.
Marjorie, we discussed with John Gruber the other day how Elizabeth Warren, when she finally announces funding for Medicare for all, how she's going to pay for it. Do you know how she pays for her education reform?
Wealth tax.
Wealth tax. So
Yeah,
we
she
now
got a lot of
have
money
child
coming
care.
out of the wealth
We
tax.
have student loan forgiveness and education reform, which I think sort of narrows the ability to use taxes on the wealthy to fund Medicare.
It does seem
for all.
it's we're like chipping away at the margins, and there's something big that's wrong that we're not willing to revolutionize.
Yeah, I mean, I think we built an education system in the early 20th century to educate 10% of our kids to a high level, because that's all we needed in a factory-based economy. Now we're in a 21st century economy where we basically need everybody. It's the other ratio. We need 90% of people, high skills and high knowledge. We don't have a system that's built for that.
Okay,
It's too weak on average to accomplish that result.
One more minute on this. You become the Education Secretary of the United States, and you don't have to run any proposal by Congress or the President. Give us the top two things that you would do that would make a real difference in a reasonable period of time.
I'd make early childhood education available to everybody who wanted it, and I'd start it early. I'd start it
4?
no, even before that.
Really?
I'd start it around 2 or 3.
Wow.
Yeah, and because that makes a huge difference.
Does anybody do it at 2 or 3 in public settings or
Not
no?
in public settings. There
Okay.
are all kinds of voluntary programs
Yep.
that if you're lucky enough to get it, you get it.
What's the second
The other
one?
thing I do is I'd make summer enrichment available to every child.
would do too.
We've got a lot of evidence to support that makes a big difference. So those would be just 2 things I do. Probably a third I do is to deal with the issues of mental health. To get Medicaid coverage operating in such a way that kids' mental health needs can be met outside of school.
So,
Yeah.
well, you're my nominee for education secretary. Let me just say.
One of the issues. There were a lot of issues in the Chicago teacher strike, and a lot of them were the things you were talking about: more counselors, more mental health people, more nurses, and stuff.
Yeah.
But they also wanted to shorten the school day in Chicago.
Yeah,
So that they could have 45 minutes for prep time. Is that not what the
I
shortening
think it
was
was
for?
both.
No, it was. They wanted more prep time, and
Yep.
they had given up prep time last time, and so there's a decent argument for more prep time. But it's emblematic of this struggle that we go where we regard the school day as somehow sacrosanct and fixed. So they're asking for more time instead of saying, okay, let's talk about adding 45 minutes to the school day. They're saying let's take it out of instructional time, and
Right.
and so that's cheating the kids for more prep time for the teachers,
Marjorie's
which may be a
glaring at me,
reasonable
by the way.
request. So but it's not just on the teachers union there, it's on the whole system. In other words, we've got to do more. So we need a longer school day if we're going to accomplish all these things that we're setting out to accomplish, which is to get all of our kids to a level heretofore reserved for the elite few.
You think to yourself, if the best teachers made $250,000 a year, you wouldn't say you should. It was outrageous to work from 8 in the morning to 6 o'clock at night because people that make $250,000 a year.
Well, how
usually
come
not
every
working
single
40
time I say to you, if they should work a
Merit
longer
pay.
day, which I agree
Merit
with,
pay.
they should get paid more?
Because you have to pay the best teachers the most money. They're a profession like everybody else, and I think that we're never going to pay teachers. If you're waiting to pay everybody across the board a huge amount of money, it's not going to happen. But if you pay the best teachers, and we don't,
Well, I think you're both right at one level. I mean, I think you've got to have a baseline where we don't have, as we've seen in places like West Virginia and Arizona and Oklahoma, teachers having to work 2 and 3 jobs just to put food on the table.
which is disgraceful.
So it is disgraceful. So you got to have a baseline of salary and benefits that allow you to live a decent middle class life, and then on top of that, we've got to develop a more effective system for rewarding performance. Because if you don't reward good performance and if you don't sanction poor performance, you're just going to get mediocrity.
Okay, so Marjorie,
Paul Revlle is a professor at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education, where he also runs their education redesign lab. He's got a new book out, co-authored with Elaine Weiss. It's called Broader, Bolder, Better: How Schools and Communities Help Students Overcome the Disadvantages of Poverty. Thank you very much, Paul Revlle. Up next, Paradise Lost. This new Frontline documentary looks at the fire that ravaged California last year, why it was so catastrophic as wildfires are devouring much of California right now. Stay tuned for that in 89.7 WGBH, Boston Public Radio.
welcome back to Boston Public Radio. I'm Jim Browdy. She's Marjorie. And last November, wildfires leveled Paradise, California. It took only 4 hours to burn the whole town to the ground. Cars and homes continued to burn for weeks, and in the end, killed 85 people, burned more than 150,000 acres, obliterated more than 18,000 buildings, making it the most destructive and deadliest wildfire in California.